Do you remember the very first time that you visited this church? I realize that for a few of you, today may be the very first time that you visited this church, and I want to tell you how thrilled I am that you chose to be here or got dragged here or got bribed to be here or whatever happened, However you got here, I'm glad that you're here for today, but I'm betting that everybody, almost everybody in this room, unless you came when you were like a really small child, almost everybody in this room, Hans is nodding, he said, yeah, I don't remember, but everybody else in the room can remember the first time they visited this church family. And your first visit may have been in this present location, or it may have been in the early 2000s while this building was being constructed and we were meeting at Fossil Ridge High School, or it may have been even before that at our Midtown location dating all the way back to 1970. But at some point or another, we all visited this church family for the first time. And I wonder if you remember how it felt. When I visited this church family for the first time, it was nearly 20 years ago, and I was interviewing for a job, so my circumstances were a little bit different, but I'll bet you and I had some of the same questions. Where do I find things? Where's the bathroom? Is this place warm and welcoming? Can I picture myself making friends here? Is there coffee? That's an important one. What does this church teach and believe? I had some of those same kind of questions that most people experience when they're a first-time guest at a church, but maybe the big question that was behind all of that, the one big question that was kind of the umbrella over all of those other smaller details that I was trying to investigate, was the question, can I fit in here? Can I be a part of this family? I think everybody has a story or two about the things they've done that made them later felt foolish, but the things they've done to try to fit in. I mean, every generation has their fashion classics, right? Some of the pants that you wore in high school, actually the ones you wore in high school are probably back in fashion. But we all have some stories of some things that we did along the way to try to fit in, things we said, identities we tried on, places we went, choices we made, to see if we could fit in with a particular group. Now, I've got a story I could tell on myself here if you want to hear it, but we can skip this part. Okay. Well, we'll meet after service, whoever that one person was. No, I'm kidding. Well, there was a moment when I was in 8th grade and a friend invited me to go to a retreat with their church, with their youth ministry from their church, and I was in the early stages of sculpting the chiseled physique that you see here before you today, and I weighed 95 pounds, and I was ready to add some more muscle to really bulk up to impress the ladies at that time, and so I couldn't let a little thing like a 2-day retreat interrupt my strict training schedule. And so I decided to pack dumbbells in my duffel bag to bring with me to the retreat. I thought, well, I'm going to, find some free time and utilize these things. And so there I was, all 95 pounds of me with a duffel bag that weighed about 60 pounds. And when we got to the campground, the bus parked right up next to the girls' cabins so that the girls wouldn't have to walk very far. But the guys' cabins were about 200 yards that way across this big open field where everybody could see what you were doing. And I sure wasn't going to stoop to ask somebody else to help me carry that bag, but I wish you could have seen me dragging that duffel bag across the campus, trying to get there, looking so ridiculous. In fact, that's probably part of the decision I made never to lift weights again, ever, after that day. But fitting in is hard. It's like, fitting in is like carrying a heavy burden around, just hoping to find a safe place to put it down. It's like trying to figure out where is the one location that you're going to be accepted for being you? And when you come to church, you want to believe that churches ought to be an easy place to fit in. I mean, there's all this talk about loving one another and being a good neighbor and doing unto others as you do unto yourself and all of that kind of stuff. But there's two things I believe are true about churches with respect to this. One is that most of us didn't come to church just to make friends, but we won't go to a church for long if we don't make friends. Does that make sense to you? We didn't show up here simply because we were trying to find people. We were trying to grow in our vertical relationship with God as well, and we were hoping that there would be some horizontal relationship happening at the same time. But if you show up and you become part of a church family and there's no horizontal relationship that develops, there's probably not going to be much hope for you or desire for you to want to stick around a place like that. I mean, think about this. Have you been to HEB yet? Nobody goes to HEB to find a parking space, right? Like, that's not why you're showing up. But if you go to HEB and you don't find a parking space, you're probably not going to stick around for very long, right? And in fact, you're probably not going to want to come back very often. And I think the same is true when people try out a new church. You may come to be a part of a church family, or you may remember when you came to be a part of this church family because you wanted to grow closer to God. But if you go to a particular church for a while and you don't develop any friendships, you'll probably start to look for another church, or maybe even consider giving up on church altogether. Because the truth is that everybody needs community. Sometimes we feel bulletproof, sometimes we feel strong enough, sometimes we feel like we can make it on our own, but everybody needs community to keep us encouraged, to keep us accountable, to keep us connected, to keep us moving in the direction that God has called us to go. And community does more than just make us feel good about ourselves, make us feel like we fit in. Community has the potential, and I believe God designed it this way, community has the potential to point us toward the Lord. And today we're going to talk about one of the surefire ways that you can find connection in the church that you need. But more than that, we're talking about how we go about creating this kind of connected community that's made possible when we share the love of God. And we're going to start by looking at a passage from the New Testament portion of the Bible that talks about the impression churches can make on first-time visitors and how we build community with each other. So if you've got a Bible with you, maybe on your app or on your lap, either way, you can turn to the book of James near the end of the New Testament. There's this book that was actually written by one of Jesus's brothers. Now Jesus called a lot of people brother, but I'm talking about like one of the people who shared a bedroom with Jesus growing up. Like they had bunk beds and he was on the top and the creator of the universe is on the bottom. This guy had a unique experience. James's story stands out because even though he grew up in the same house as Jesus, he didn't believe that his brother was his Lord until later in life. He didn't grow up thinking that the one he was fighting with, for whose turn it was in the bathroom, he didn't grow up thinking, that's my Savior. Can you imagine what it was like to grow up in that situation like James did? As far as we know, he didn't become a Christ follower until after Jesus' resurrection, when Jesus appeared in the flesh to a number of eyewitnesses, and 1 Corinthians 15 says that James was one of those. One of the people who got to see his brother resurrected from the dead. But once James became a convert to Christianity, he dove in all the way. And he became a leader in the church in Jerusalem. And he wrote this letter that we're looking at today, which we call the book of James. And it includes some of the most practical teaching in the New Testament about how to live like Jesus. And I want you to listen to the way he talks about his brother. All right, this is chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. James, the brother of Jesus, says, "Now, brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ." Now, just stop there for a second and think about the transformation that happened in James's life for him to start a sentence like that. For him to think about the guy that he grew up sharing the bedroom with and say, he is our glorious Lord. It's a big deal. But here's what James, with his unique insight into Jesus's way of living and being and teaching, James has a unique vantage point. And he says, brothers and sisters, if you're a believer in our glorious Lord Jesus, you must not show favoritism, he says. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy old clothes also comes in. I thought about staging it and just having the doors open really loudly right now and two guys walk in, you know. Suppose these two scenarios. A rich man comes in one door, a poor man comes in the other door, and it's obvious in both cases. James says, if you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and you say, here's a good seat for you. I noticed we saved a few seats up here on the front row this morning that are available, in case any of you wanted to move up, and that's okay. He said, if you say to the rich man, here's a good seat for you, but you say to the poor man, we got room for you to stand over there in the back. Or, here's a spot on the floor. We don't want to get these chairs dirty. If you were to say something like that, James says, have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Now, treating people that way sounds like something so harsh that you would never expect to see that in churches, but I'm afraid sometimes it does happen. And sometimes it's obvious. You know, I can remember a moment about 15 years ago, right here in this church family, one of the young men in our church started dating this lady who was somewhat of a celebrity. She had been an NFL cheerleader, and then she had gone on to be a contestant on some major TV reality shows. And when he brought her to church, it was funny to watch how the church was suddenly abuzz about having a famous person among us. There were people who never talked to first-time visitors at church who suddenly were waiting around to greet this young couple and to make sure that they knew that they were welcomed and that we were excited that they had shown up at church. Thank you for being with us this morning. Sometimes our preferential treatment is pretty overt. But sometimes it's more sneaky. Sometimes it's more concealed. I talked to a pastor friend who took a job at a new church, and this church that he went to serve had a long history of doing a coat drive in the early winter months to provide coats for the poor in the wintertime. And every year they gave away an average of 8,000 coats in their cold climate city. And this had gone on for a decade and a half. It had become a very well-known event. In fact, people anticipated that season, the coat drive season, was coming up, and the people who needed a coat would frequently line up at the church the day before the coat drive actually happened in mid-November, and they would spend the night outside on the sidewalk waiting for the coat drive to open up. Now think about this. This is in the early winter time, and these are people who don't have coats already, and they're spending the night outside. And this was the reason that my pastor friend was telling me this story, because he was talking about how when he showed up and saw this happening for the first time, he was embarrassed that these folks were being asked to wait outside overnight in the cold, and there were people in the church who were afraid of what might happen if we let the poor people in. And this church hosts events in their building all the time, but they were subconsciously or maybe consciously showing favoritism and stereotyping people in need. And so my pastor friend and some others made a big push to move the waiting area inside the auditorium of the church. And you know what? He said that year they gave away 12,000 coats. He said it was a totally different experience. And maybe the bigger thing was, he said every year they would always ask people as they were picking up the coat, is there anything that we could do to be praying for you? Anything about your going on in your life that we could be praying about? And he said the number of people who actually stopped and wanted to have a conversation about prayer skyrocketed just exponentially because they could feel the love of that church. And that story reminds me of some of the common weaknesses that we all have to stand on guard against, because if we're not careful, we will find ourselves being hospitable and gracious to people who are like us in some way. people that we know from the get-go that we have a lot in common with, people that have something to offer to us, people who we think have resources, people who we think have influence. We can be so blinded by our own self-centeredness that we can knowingly or unknowingly mistreat people that we don't feel like have anything to offer to us. It's scary. And the problem is we're not good judges. We're not good judges of the worth of the people that cross our paths. Did you notice in the last few words of that passage we read, James chapter 2, verse 4, he says, if you show favoritism like the ways he describes, he says, have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? The problem is we're not good judges. In fact, James goes on in verse 5. He says, listen, my dear brothers and sisters, hasn't God chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith? Some of you have seen this firsthand. He says, hasn't God chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom that he promised those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich, he says, and this is a rhetorical question, is it not the rich who are exploiting you? Are they not the ones who are dragging you into court? Are they not the ones who are blaspheming the noble name of him to whom you belong, my brother, our glorious Lord Jesus? James says if you're ignoring or minimizing relationship with someone just because they don't impress you with their appearance or their possessions or their personality or their position, if you ignore somebody because of that sort of impression you have about them, then you're missing out on some of the richest relationships you can find. In fact, God is full of surprises. And even though you think you know which relationships are worth pursuing, God has placed spiritual giants around you and among us, but they're some of the people from whom you would least expect it. And our tendency is to enter into and to foster relationships based on what we can get, based on what we feel, to invest our time and energy into those who it appears will help us get a little further along the road with our goals. You may remember that Jesus himself had something to say about this. Luke chapter 14, Jesus said, he was at a dinner, and he says to his host, he says, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers, your sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. Now, I don't think Jesus is saying you can never have a meal with people that you're related to or anything like that. But I think what Jesus is talking about is when you start to manipulate some of the social arrangements, some of the social connection, when you start to try to be strategic about who's going to be the most advantageous person to spend time with, Jesus says you're on the wrong track. And in the next verse he says, verse 13, but when you give a banquet, invite the poor, invite the crippled, invite the lame, invite the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Which is to say, they can't repay you, but there's somebody who sees what you're doing who can, right? There's somebody who sees what you're doing when you look for God, the evidence of what God is doing among the people that God sees suffering in our world. The people who God sees isolated and lonely in our world. You can read all through Scripture and find that God is close to those who are brokenhearted. God is close to those who are sad. God is close to those who are lonely. God is close to those who do without. And we'd be wise, if we want to be close to God, to get close to those, wouldn't we? It shouldn't surprise us when Jesus reveals to us that he has different priorities than we do. But if Jesus has something to say about who you invite over for your dinner parties, you'd think it would be something about, don't invite people that are corrupt. Don't invite people with bad character. Don't invite people who are going to be a negative influence on you. But he doesn't say anything about their morality. He doesn't say anything about their ethics. He talks about their vulnerability. He talks about their isolation. He talks about the things that make the world forget about them. And he says, when you have the chance to invite somebody over, invite somebody who doesn't always get an invitation. Invite somebody who didn't expect to be invited. Offer hospitality. Make room for the people who most often get forgotten. You remember that scene, maybe you saw the movie a couple dozen years ago, I guess, I don't know, Forrest Gump. When young Forrest gets on the school bus for the first time, and he's got the braces on his legs, and it's hard for him to climb the stairs of the bus, but he gets up there, and as he's walking down the aisle looking for a place to sit, there's spaces available on nearly every row, but every time he walks past another row, out of spite or just plain meanness, the students in that row scoot towards the middle, and they say, "You can't sit here. Seats taken. You can't sit here, seats taken." And you know grade school. Grade school can do a good job of exposing our natural human inclinations. Anybody who's ever tried to find a seat in the cafeteria at the grade school knows what it's like to try to find the place where you fit in, where you'll be accepted, where you'll be allowed and invited. But standing in the aisle of that school bus wondering if he had a place, Forrest heard a quiet voice say, "You can sit here if you want to." And if you know the movie, you know that simple invitation was all it took to spark a lifelong friendship between Forrest and Jenny, right? You know, one of the characteristics that for centuries marked Christianity was that Jesus' followers offered hospitality to others that the world didn't recognize. But hospitality is more than just a feature of the service industry. Hospitality comes from the same root word as other welcoming and soothing and healing places like hospitals and hospices and hostels and hotels. For centuries, Christians used to provide hospitality, gracious hospitality to strangers, and eventually began to fund and build hospitals and hospices and hostels to focus those hospitality efforts. But one of the unintended consequences was that the work of hospitality became specialized and institutionalized and impersonal. And meanwhile, in churches, hospitality became synonymous with entertaining. We talked about people who had the gift of hospitality, and usually they were good cooks, or they knew how to set a table well or plan a party, and those are beautiful things, but there's more to it. Henry Nouwen wrote that hospitality conjures up for us images of tea parties and bland conversation and a general atmosphere of coziness, but hospitality is not about making sure that guests are entertained. Hospitality is about making sure that guests are welcomed, that they're invited, that they feel warmth and genuine acceptance. Hospitality is about making room. It's about scooting over and saying, "You can sit here if you want to." Hospitality is about making sure that somebody else has a place to sit down and rest, to lay down that heavy burden of that duffel bag that they've been carrying with the dumbbells in it, right? Hospitality is about making sure that somebody else has a place to fit in, and I believe God's calling us all to do more to make room. If you've been around Heritage for very long, you know that one of our very favorite ways to help people connect is through our ministry of small groups. Our small groups are these little collections of people who commit to get together on a regular basis, to get to know one another, to encourage one another in their spiritual growth as we all navigate life's challenges and seasons. And the most successful of our small groups stick together for a long time. They get to know each other well, and they know each other's families and their kids, and like somebody needs to know your dog's name, that kind of thing. The kind of people that you trust, the kind of people that you build that kind of relationship with that matters, that you could call them in an emergency. Like that kind of stuff is really important. But it gets started when somebody decides to scoot over and make room, right? It gets started when somebody says, let's sit together. Let's connect with one another. And we've discovered around here, over years of small group practice, we've discovered that small group is not just meaningful because it can give you a place to fit in. It also is meaningful because it creates an opportunity for you to make a difference. It feels really good to be the person walking down the aisle of the bus and to have somebody say, come sit with me. That feels great. But it also feels good. And it's also Christ-like to be the person sitting in that seat and scooting over and saying, I saved you a spot. You can sit here if you want to. And we've discovered that church is better when we're together. And so this morning, I'm actually going to bring two people from our church, Clint and Monica Bryant, up to the stage and ask them to grab a couple of these microphones here on this stand. And I've asked Clint and Monica just to think a little bit about what some of the reasons that small group has meant something to them for a long time. Clint and Monica have been members of Heritage now for over 17 years, and I don't remember exactly, but one of you can tell me. Just flip that switch. There you go. That'll be on, and flip that one there. Tell me, how many years have you been a part of the same small group?
Actually, one of my earliest Heritage memories is meeting you right over there.
And you survived. That's fantastic.
And we started going here in June of 2007, and we joined a small group in June of 2007. You could technically say it is the same small group, although it's, we got too big a couple of times with people having kids. We split a few times, but we never changed groups. The group just changed over time. There's one couple here that is still in the group with us, and everyone else has come and gone over the years.
Yeah, and I know that there was always at least one person in the group that you already had long relationship with and stuff like that. But tell me about what it was like for you to join a group and to open your life up a little bit to some people that were strangers to you. Like, what did that feel like in the beginning?
Well, I remember the first time we visited. I believe he was out of town. And for work, and
she joined the small group.
So
that happens.
We sat over here, and someone met me after church, and they're like, "Hey, well, are you interested in joining a small group? Are you, going to be around?" And I said, "Yes, yeah, that sounds great." And then they're like, "Well, actually, we're meeting tonight, and are you able to come?" And I said, "Well, yes." Mm-hmm. And then they were like, "Well, can you bring some drinks? Actually, that'd be great." And I said, "Yes, I can." So it was just a series of just continuing to say yes. And it led to some great lifelong friendships that we have. People have moved on and, moved for different reasons, but it's been wonderful. So it was a great decision.
So I love that story, and I remember too that 17 years ago we were all young married people with no kids, and now you have 4 kids, and life's a little busy, right? Like, it's been hectic, there's been some stuff going on, but for 17 years you've continued being a part of this. I want to tell me a little bit about why you've wanted to stick with this, why you have found this to be something that is worth your energy and your time and your investment in it.
Sure. Obviously, we're here to worship and praise God, but if you're not making Christian relationships, you're missing out on one of the big reasons to be here. Years ago, I got in a conversation with a guy about small groups, and he was like, "Well, I'm just signing up to join a friend group." And my response was, exactly. You're going to make friends, work, school, whatever. You want to make good friends. It's not just something we preach to our kids. Mm-hmm. It's something we need to take for our whole lives. And whoever you're, if you're around 5 drug addicts, you'll be the 6th. You're around 5 millionaires, you'll be the 6th. You're around 5 Christians, you'll be the 6th. So we think that's a huge part of it, is just picking good people to be around in our lives and setting that example for our kids. And then, of course, just the relationships that we've made over the years and the friendships that we have. And now with kids, the friendships that our kids have made with small groups. So.
Monica, what about for you? Why has this been something that's been worth it, even in some of the busiest years of your life?
Just being able to have friends to lean on. I think among our group, we're all like the emergency contacts for all of our kids, at school and stuff. So just for kids, letting them know that these are other trusted adults that if there was an emergency they could go with, and other moms and dads that they can trust and talk to if they have a problem. We want our kids to have a lot of Christian adults available to help them in their faith journey.
Absolutely. So it's been a part of your family, which I appreciate so much. One last question. I know that small group has meant a lot to you personally. It's given you a lot of connection, and it's done something for your family. But I also want to hear about the ways that small group has allowed you to scoot over and make space for somebody else. How has it given you opportunity to serve and to be there for others who need help?
Lots of ways. Obviously, if you know other people in this world, you're going to go through things, they're going to go through things, you're going to need help, they're going to need help. Just on a generic, hey, my car broke down, or hey, we just had a kid, bring food. And being part of this small group, we've done group things like mission projects, working at Christ-Haven, working at the church here. So there's been plenty of opportunities, and will continue to be, of just, hey, I need a prayer request, or hey, I need you to loan me your car for a week, whatever it is. So small, big, but yeah, there's and being in a small group, you hear about more things going on through, hey, oh, I didn't know about that. Oh, okay, thanks. Yeah.
I think there have been lots of needs that we've been able to meet as a small group. Something that we did that was really fun was help host the church picnic last spring, and that was, I think it was a great opportunity to just serve the church. And then also out of the women in our small group, some of us formed like a baby shower committee. We saw a need that we wanted to be able to take care of new moms, or, moms of 2nd, 3rd, 4th babies, whatever. And so we decided to put together a baby shower committee and throw showers for them, and just create a space for other members in the church to give gifts if they want to bless those moms. So lots of opportunities to serve.
I love those stories, and I'm so grateful to you. In fact, your small group and your small group experience is kind of a model that we want to point other people to, because it has made such a difference, not only in your lives and your children's lives, but in the lives of our church family. And it's really, it's kind of a success story of what we hope could be possible for everybody else. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective. Let's give them our gratitude this morning. Thank you, Clint and Monica. 17 years ago, they made the brave decision to try this out. And it's become a part of their life that they wouldn't want to do without. And they've scooted over, and they've made room so that other heritage families could come along in more recent years and find the kind of connection that their small group started building almost 2 decades ago. To experience the kind of hospitality and warmth and generosity and connection and purpose that the small group has provided for Clint and for Monica and their family. But it's the kind of connection that we want for you. We want to create a way so that you feel like this church, and at least a little subset of the families of this church, are like family for you. And so we're inviting you in this season to engage or re-engage with small groups ministry if you've done it before. And it's not just, I hope you're hearing me say this, it's not just because we know you're going to get something out of it. It's because there's going to be somebody in that group who needs you. There's going to be somebody in that group who's wondering, where do I fit in? And they're going to be looking, is there somebody who's got room for me to sit by them, who will say you can sit here if you want to. And so small group's going to offer something to you, but it's going to give you a chance to live out this calling to faithful hospitality that Jesus demonstrated so well for us. And so I want to tell you that on your way out today, there's a table in the lobby. There's an opportunity. If you're not already currently in a small group, we would be thrilled to help do the arranging and the matchmaking that has to happen to find a group that works for your schedule. And, maybe you want to be in a group with people in a similar stage of life or anything like that. And that's absolutely, we'd be thrilled to help with that process. But I also want to tell you, most of the people in our church who are in a small group didn't get in a group because they asked the office to make it happen. Most of the people in our church who were in a small group had an experience where, like Clint and Monica, somebody said, hey, we're having group and we'd love for you to come. Or they asked around and said, I don't have a small group. Do you have a small group? They asked somebody that they knew and they said, do you have a group? And when does it meet? And could I be a part? And we're asking all of our small groups to make room, to open up space so that we could be connected. Because church is better when we're together. So I don't want you to miss this chance. I don't want you to miss this opportunity so that this place, this group can feel like family for you, but also so that you could make it feel like family for somebody else.